What if I told you there's a man whose songs earn money even while he's sleeping? A man whose melodies will keep paying his family long after he's gone? Paul McCartney isn't just a musician. He's built something that most people can only dream about. A fortune so massive that when his family thinks about it, they can't help but cry. Not from sadness, but from the weight of what he's leaving behind. Today, we're going to walk through the incredible story of how a barefoot boy from war-torn Liverpool became one of the richest musicians in history, worth over $1 billion. And trust me, by the end of the story, you'll understand why his legacy makes everyone emotional. Let's go back to where it all started. June 18, 1942, Liverpool, England. The city was in ruins from German bombing raids. People were hungry. Buildings were destroyed. Hope was hard to find. Into this broken world came Paul McCartney, born to a family that had almost nothing. They lived in a tiny house on Forthland Road in a neighborhood called Allerton. There were no fancy cars outside, no grand piano in the living room, no wealth at all, just a small family trying to survive in difficult times. Paul's mother, Mary, worked as a nurse. She would come home exhausted after long shifts, but she always found energy to take care of her boys. His father, Jim, was a jazz musician who owned an old beat-up piano. Jim didn't have money to give his sons, but he gave them something else. He gave them music. Every night the sound of piano keys would fill their small home. It wasn't much, but it was everything to young Paul. But then tragedy struck. When Paul was just 14 years old, his mother got sick. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and within weeks, she was gone. One day she was there, the next day she wasn't. Paul would later say that losing his mother carved a hole in his heart that never healed. The house that once echoed with music now felt silent and empty. His father Jim had to become both mother and father to Paul, and his younger brother Michael. Here's where the story takes an important turn. Instead of letting grief destroy him, Paul found escape in music. He picked up his guitar more often. He practiced harder. Music became his way of coping with the pain. Years later, Paul would write the famous song, "Let It Be." And when he sang about Mother Mary coming to him in dreams, he wasn't talking about a religious figure. He was singing about his own mother, the woman whose death changed everything. At 15, Paul met another boy who understood loss. His name was John Lennon, and he had also lost his mother too young. These two broken boys sat together on worn-out sofas with their guitars and started writing songs. They transformed their grief into harmony, their pain into poetry. What started as two kids trying to sing louder than their sadness eventually became something the world had never seen before. They called themselves the Beatles. But success didn't come easy. In the late 1950s, Paul was barely 16 years old, carrying a guitar that felt heavier than his dreams. Nobody believed in them. Liverpool didn't care about their music. So they went to Hamburg, Germany, hoping for a chance. What they found there was brutal. They slept in disgusting rooms behind nightclubs. Their beds had bugs crawling in them. They played for 8 hours straight, night after night, until their fingers bled and their voices gave out. They ate scraps of food and often went to bed hungry. To keep going, they took cheap drugs that kept them awake. Their teenage bodies were grinding toward collapse. Paul later admitted they didn't play because they loved it in those moments. They played because if they stopped, they were finished. The audiences weren't kind either. Drunk sailors would yell insults at them. Bar owners would scream when they made mistakes. The pay barely covered another day of survival. But Hamburg did something important. It turned them from boys into musicians. It taught them how to perform under pressure. It showed them that if they could survive this, they could survive anything. Then another tragedy hit. In April 1962, their friend and original bass player Stuart Sutcliffe collapsed and died from a brain hemorrhage. He was only 21 years old. For Paul, it felt like losing his mother all over again. Death seemed to follow him everywhere. After Stuart died, Paul didn't want to, but he had to pick up the bass guitar. He admitted it felt like being stuck in the back of the band. But something magical happened. Instead of just playing background rhythm, Paul started treating the bass like it was singing. He made it melodic and beautiful. He changed the way rock music sounded forever, all because of a role he never wanted. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were the biggest band on planet Earth. Millions of people screamed their names. Their songs played on every radio station. Paul wrote some of the most famous songs in history during this time. Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, Penny Lane, Blackbird. These weren't just hit songs. They were songs people sang at weddings and funerals. Songs that helped people through their darkest moments. Songs that became part of people's lives. But fame came with a price. In 1967, their manager Brian Epstein died suddenly. He was the person who held the band together, and without him, things started falling apart. Paul, who was only 25 years old, tried to keep everyone together, but the pressure was crushing him. His friendship with John Lennon, once so strong, started to crack. Songs that used to be written together now carried hidden arguments. Paul's optimistic Penny Lane clashed with John's darker Strawberry Fields Forever. Then something really strange happened in 1966. A crazy rumor started spreading that Paul had died in a car crash and been replaced by a look-alike. Fans searched through album covers and played records backward looking for clues about Paul's death. Can you imagine being alive while the whole world insists you're dead? Paul later said it left scars deeper than anyone knew. It did something to his mind that he couldn't explain. By September 1969, John Lennon whispered that he was leaving the band. For Paul, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath his feet. On April 10, 1970, Paul announced to the world what nobody wanted to hear. The Beatles were over. Millions of people gasped in shock. But for Paul, it was worse than grief. The Beatles were my family, he said years later. Losing them felt like losing myself. Paul retreated to his farm in Scotland. He was 28 years old, and he didn't know who he was anymore without the Beatles. He drank to numb the pain. He wandered his fields aimlessly with his guitar sitting silent in his lap. He questioned whether music even mattered anymore. This was the darkest period of his life. But Paul had something the Beatles didn't have when they were together. He had Linda. Linda McCartney wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor. They had met in the mid-1960s when Paul was drowning in fame that felt empty. Linda didn't care about the screaming fans or the celebrity status. She just saw Paul, the person behind the legend. They married in 1969, just 1 year before the Beatles broke up. And for Paul, Linda's presence saved his life. Together, they started rebuilding. In 1970, locked in his home studio, Paul recorded an album called McCartney, where he played every single instrument himself. Critics hated it. They called it unfinished and self-indulgent. But looking back now, we can see it was actually a man fighting to survive through music. In 1971, Paul and Linda made another album called Ram. Again, critics mocked it and said Paul's genius was gone. Then Paul formed a new band called Wings with Linda and a guitarist named Denny Lane. But the struggle continued. People didn't want Paul without John Lennon. Critics were hostile. Money was tight because Paul had to pay for everything himself. Tours, equipment, rehearsals. More than once, he spent more money than he earned. The ghost of Lennon and McCartney hung over everything he did. But then came 1977. Paul was 35 years old and scarred by years of doubt. Wings released a song called Mull of Kintyre. It was a simple ballad about the Scottish countryside, where Paul had hidden from the world after the Beatles ended. The song didn't just succeed, it shattered British music history. It sold over 2 million copies in the UK alone, and became the country's best-selling single of all time, even bigger than Beatles songs. Finally, Paul felt vindicated. The money from that song and Wings' massive tours began building what would eventually become his billion-dollar fortune. Through all of this, Linda stood by his side. She learned to play keyboards even though critics said she didn't belong on stage. She raised their 4 children, Mary, Stella, James, and Heather, whom Paul adopted, as his own. Their homes weren't just showcases of wealth, they were sanctuaries of family, laughter, and love. Linda was Paul's defiance against a world that demanded perfection. His statement that love, not fame, was the foundation of his art. But then fate struck with cruel precision. In 1995, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 53 years old, the same disease that had taken Paul's mother when he was 14. Paul, now 53 himself, was thrown into a nightmare. It was like time folded in on itself, dragging him back to the worst moment of his childhood. He later said, "It felt like the end of the world." On April 17, 1998, Linda died. She was 56. Paul was 55. He didn't just lose his wife. He lost the person who kept him whole. The grief wasn't something that came and went. It seeped into everything. Every room felt too empty. Every song reminded him of her. Music, which had always been his refuge, now became both comfort and torture. Every melody echoed the woman who used to sing off-key in their kitchen with pure joy. Paul often disappeared into the countryside, walking alone for hours. "You never get over losing someone like that," he said. "You just learn to live alongside the emptiness." But even in his darkest moments, Paul didn't collapse. He carried Linda's legacy forward. Her photography, her passion for vegetarianism, animal rights, and environmental causes. He preserved her images and videos like sacred treasures. He turned his grief into action, making sure Linda's voice never fell silent. After Linda's death, Paul was lost. In 1999, he met Heather Mills, an activist and former model. She seemed like a spark of light in his darkness. In 2002, when Paul was 60 years old, he married her, daring to open his scarred heart again. They had a daughter named Beatrice in 2003, and for a moment, Paul believed happiness could return. But this marriage was nothing like his life with Linda. Instead of privacy and peace, there was constant media attention. Tabloids spread rumors. Cameras followed their every move. Fractures appeared early. By 2006, trust had turned to accusations. Love had turned cold. The divorce in 2008 was brutal. Paul was 66 years old, standing in a courtroom under harsh lights while cameras captured his pain. Heather demanded hundreds of millions. The judge awarded her $24 million. For Paul, this wasn't just about money. It was the public dismantling of a love he had hoped would heal him. Unlike Linda's death, which was private and sacred, this loss played out like a circus for the world to watch. Friends said Paul during those years spoke more with silence than words, his eyes distant and haunted. But Paul endured. He held on to what couldn't be taken away, his children, his music, and the resilience he had built over decades of triumph and tragedy. "You can't always predict how things will unfold," he said. "Sometimes you just survive." But for Paul, survival was never surrender. It was defiance. It was the choice to keep believing in love, even after it broke him twice. Then came Nancy. Nancy Shevell entered Paul's life in the late 2000s when he was a man carrying too many winters in his chest. Nancy didn't arrive like a storm. She came like a season, steady and patient. A businesswoman who understood endurance because she had her own battles. For Paul, this was the first time in decades that love felt calm instead of chaotic. In 2011, at 69 years old, Paul married Nancy in a quiet ceremony with no flashbulbs or crowds, just two people choosing each other in peace. With Nancy, Paul found simplicity, shared breakfasts, walks by the sea, laughter that wasn't performed for anyone. Friends noticed immediately. Paul had finally set down the weight he'd been carrying. He described Nancy as a pillar of strength and balance, words that sounded less like a compliment and more like a confession that she had saved him. Now let's talk about the fortune. At 83 years old in 2025, Paul McCartney's net worth is estimated at $1.2 billion. He is the wealthiest musician in recording history. His empire stretches across the world. A grand townhouse on Cavendish Avenue in London, steps from Abbey Road Studios, where Beatles magic was made. A sprawling estate in Sussex, where he retreats into countryside peace. A luxurious home in the Hamptons that he preserved exactly as Linda loved it. A Beverly Hills mansion where he grieved and wrote after her death. His garage is like a museum. Rolls-Royce Phantoms that once carried the Beatles through screaming crowds, an Aston Martin DB5 shining like the spirit of the 1960s. Jaguars and Bentleys, each one a milestone rather than just a trophy. And then there are his instruments. The Hofner bass that sang through Yesterday and Hey Jude. Guitars worn by decades of playing, each string vibrating with history. But here's what's really incredible. Paul's fortune isn't just sitting in banks. His songs earn money every single day. Every time Hey Jude plays on the radio, he gets paid. Every time someone streams Let It Be on their phone, money flows into his accounts. Every wedding that plays Maybe I'm Amazed, every movie that uses Live and Let Die, every commercial that licenses his music, Paul McCartney gets paid. His catalog of songs is worth more than gold because it will keep earning forever. Paul has quietly donated over $100 million to causes he cares about. Environmental campaigns, animal rights, humanitarian relief, and music education for young people. While he's never publicly discussed his will, it's believed his fortune will be divided between his children and the charitable missions he supported throughout his life. In 2024, at 82 years old, Paul went on tour again with his Got Back tour. He crossed continents, filling arenas where 3 generations of fans sang together. Young people and old people, all singing songs written before many of them were born. These weren't just concerts. They were reunions between a man and the millions of lives his music touched. As of August 2025, Paul completed a brand new studio album. Another masterpiece to add to a catalog already heavy with genius. At 83, he's still creating, still performing, still proving that art born from truth doesn't age. His face has lines now, but they're not signs of weakness. They're symbols of experience, carved into the skin of a man who has lived more lives than most people could survive. He maintains his strength with a plant-based diet, daily yoga, and long walks. The vices of his youth are long gone, set aside out of love for his grandchildren. Paul lives between London, Sussex, and the Hamptons. Nancy is by his side, the quiet anchor who helped him find peace after decades of storms. Their love isn't performed for cameras. It's lived in garden walks and dinners where laughter is more important than anything else. But even in his peace, memory haunts him. In a 2023 interview, Paul admitted softly, "There are nights I still reach for memories that feel like smoke. I fear the day when I can't recall their voices." He was talking about his mother Mary, taken when he was 14. About Linda, whose absence still lives in every room she once fills. Lead. About John Lennon, shot and killed in 1980. About George Harrison, who died from cancer in 2001. This is why Paul McCartney's fortune makes his family cry. Not because of the money, though there's certainly plenty of that. They cry because of what the fortune represents. Every dollar is a melody. Every property is a memory. Every instrument is a bridge he built to carry himself and an entire generation through grief and loss. Paul McCartney proved that the greatest legacy isn't fame or fortune. It's the power to turn personal sorrow into collective song. To make strangers feel less alone in the world. His music has been there for people at their weddings and funerals, in their moments of joy and their darkest hours. His songs have carried people when they couldn't carry themselves. 20 Forthland Road, that tiny house in Liverpool where Paul grew up in poverty, is now preserved by the National Trust as a historic site. It's sacred ground because it's where a revolution in music began, where a boy staring at his mother's empty chair decided that silence would not win. The Cavendish Avenue house, where Beatles classics were born, hosted Paul's wedding reception to Nancy in 2011. proof that even places of youth and turmoil can hold new beginnings. High Park Farm in Scotland, where Paul broke down after the Beatles ended, became the inspiration for Mull of Kintyre, the song that started rebuilding his fortune. Blossomwood Farm in Sussex holds a pine tree given to Paul by George Harrison before George died. Paul sometimes talks to it as if talking to his old friend. Every possession in Paul's empire has been more than wealth. It's been a witness. His private jet isn't just luxury. It's been his means of escape when applause became unbearable. His vintage cars carry ghosts of journeys past, arrivals at stadiums, departures from funerals, escapes from grief. Paul McCartney at 83 is living proof that love can rise from ashes, that grief can be transformed into art, and that music, when born from honesty, outlasts time itself. He lives with reverence for the past, gratitude for the present, and quiet wonder for tomorrow. If you've ever been lifted by Hey Jude, comforted by Let It Be, or awakened by the hope in Blackbird, then Paul's story is yours too. His music has always been more than notes on a page. It's been memory, sanctuary, and the shared heartbeat of generations. This is why when Paul's family thinks about his fortune, they cry. They're not crying from greed or sadness. They're crying because they understand that what he's leaving behind isn't just money. It's proof that a barefoot boy from bombed-out Liverpool, who lost his mother at 14 and faced every kind of grief imaginable, refused to let darkness win. He turned every loss into a melody that will outlive us all. Paul McCartney's fortune is measured not just in billions, but in the way he turned every space into a sanctuary, every object into a memory, and every wound into a song that still heals people today. His real wealth is this. He rose again and again from silence to song, proving that no ghost, not even the heaviest, can silence a soul that refuses to give up. So if you found this story as moving as I did, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves music or needs to hear a story about resilience and hope. Subscribe to this channel because we're bringing you more incredible stories about the people who changed our world through their art. Drop a comment below and tell me which Paul McCartney song means the most to you and why. Let's celebrate this living legend together. Thank you for watching, and remember, the greatest fortunes aren't counted in dollars. They're measured in the lives we touch and the hope we leave behind.